Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are covering a wave of stories that paint a disturbing picture of how wars, both hot and cold, are reshaping lives, laws, and entire societies across the globe.
I'm Maya Clarity, and we have a packed show tonight. From hunger-striking activists finally walking free in Britain, to Iran's supreme leader preparing for the possibility of assassination, to the quiet transformation of Russian society after 4 years of grinding war in Ukraine. These stories are deeply connected in ways that mainstream coverage rarely explores.
We're also going to dig into a landmark legal challenge against FIFA and UEFA at the International Criminal Court, and a massive Russian assault on Ukraine's energy infrastructure that left at least one person dead and millions facing the cold. These aren't isolated events, folks. They're chapters in the same story.
And that story is about power, about who gets to wield it, who suffers under it, and what happens when ordinary people and international institutions either challenge that power or look the other way. So stay with us. This is going to be a deep one.
Let's get right into it. Our first story tonight takes us to Britain, where 12 Palestine Action activists have been reunited with their families after being granted bail. Several of these activists had been on hunger strike while in custody. This is a story about the right to protest, about what a democratic society does with dissent, and about the human cost of standing up for what you believe in.
That's right, Alex. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, these 12 activists are members of Palestine Action, a direct action group that has been targeting arms manufacturers and companies with ties to Israel's military operations. They've been held in custody for what the group describes as acts of civil disobedience, and several of them resorted to hunger strikes while behind bars.
Let's be clear about what we're talking about here. These are people in a Western democracy who were imprisoned for protesting against arms sales to a country that is conducting military operations that have killed tens of thousands of civilians in Gaza. Whatever your position on the conflict itself, the question of whether protests should lead to prolonged imprisonment and hunger strikes in Britain is one that should concern everyone.
Absolutely. And the hunger strike element is critical. When activists reach the point where they are refusing food to protest the conditions of their detention or the legitimacy of the charges against them, that tells you something has gone profoundly wrong in the relationship between the state and its citizens. Hunger strikes are acts of last resort. They echo the suffragettes, they echo Bobby Sands, they echo a long tradition of people using their own bodies as the final instrument of protest.
The fact that they've been granted bail is significant, but we need to ask why it took this long. These individuals were engaged in property-focused direct action against arms companies. We're not talking about violence against people. We're talking about disrupting the machinery of weapons sales. And yet they were held in conditions severe enough to drive multiple people to stop eating.
And here's the broader context that often gets lost. Palestine Action has specifically targeted companies like Elbit Systems, which is Israel's largest private arms manufacturer. Their argument is straightforward: if your government won't stop selling weapons that are being used to kill civilians, then citizens have a moral obligation to intervene directly. You can agree or disagree with that position, but it's a position with deep roots in the traditions of civil disobedience.
What's also worth noting is how the British legal system has handled these cases. We've seen a pattern across multiple Western democracies of increasingly harsh treatment of pro-Palestinian protesters, from campus crackdowns in the United States to protest bans in parts of Europe. The imprisonment and hunger strikes of these 12 activists fit into a much larger pattern of states treating opposition to their foreign policy as a security threat rather than as legitimate democratic expression.
And the family reunions we saw in the footage reported by Al Jazeera are both heartwarming and heartbreaking. Heartwarming because these people are back with their loved ones. Heartbreaking because they should never have been separated in the first place under circumstances that led to hunger strikes. These are parents, children, siblings who were torn apart because their family members believed strongly enough in stopping arms sales to risk their own freedom.
The question now is what happens next. They're out on bail, but they still face charges. The legal battles ahead will be a test case for the limits of protest in Britain, and the outcomes will send a signal to every activist in the country about what the state will and will not tolerate. We'll be watching this closely.
Now let's shift to a story that carries enormous geopolitical implications. According to reporting from Middle East Eye, Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has reportedly laid out detailed plans for the continuity of government in the event of war or his own assassination. He has reportedly entrusted the country's security chief with the authority to run the country if either scenario comes to pass.
This is a remarkable story, Maya, and it demands careful analysis. The fact that Khamenei is making these preparations public, or at least allowing them to be reported, tells us something important about the current threat environment as perceived from Tehran. This is a leader who is now 86 years old, who has led Iran for over 3 decades, and who is clearly thinking about what happens when he's gone, whether by natural causes or by something far more violent.
Let's unpack this. The succession question in Iran has been one of the most closely watched issues in Middle Eastern geopolitics for years. Khamenei's health has been the subject of intense speculation, and the question of who replaces him as supreme leader has enormous implications not just for Iran but for the entire region. By entrusting the security apparatus with continuity of government authority, Khamenei is essentially saying that in a crisis, the military and intelligence establishment will hold things together.
And that choice is telling. He's not entrusting this to the elected government, not to the president or the parliament. He's entrusting it to the security chief. That tells you where real power lies in the Islamic Republic, and it tells you what Khamenei believes the primary threats are. This is a wartime footing decision. You don't make these kinds of arrangements unless you believe the threats are real and imminent.
The timing here is critical. We're in a period of extraordinary tension between Iran and Israel, with both countries having engaged in direct military strikes against each other over the past year and a half. The assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran in mid-2024 demonstrated that Iran's adversaries are willing and able to conduct targeted killings deep inside Iranian territory. Khamenei would be the ultimate target.
And let's not forget the broader context of the Trump administration's posture toward Iran. We've seen a return to maximum pressure policies, the reimposition of sanctions, and rhetoric that has been far more aggressive than what we heard even during Trump's first term. From Tehran's perspective, the possibility of a military confrontation with the United States or Israel, or both simultaneously, is not theoretical. It's something they are actively preparing for.
What's also significant is what this tells us about internal Iranian politics. By publicly establishing a chain of command that runs through the security establishment rather than through civilian political structures, Khamenei is sending a message to potential internal rivals and reformists: the system will survive, and it will survive under the control of hardliners. This is about deterring internal instability as much as it is about external threats.
The implications for regional stability are profound. If Iran's leadership genuinely believes that assassination or war is a near-term possibility, their strategic calculations change. You become more willing to escalate proxy conflicts, more willing to accelerate weapons programs, more willing to take risks that you might otherwise avoid. A leader preparing for his own death is a leader who has less to lose.
And for the rest of the world, this should be a wake-up call. The fact that the leader of a major regional power is making public preparations for a decapitation strike against his own government means that the risk of a catastrophic conflict in the Middle East is higher than many people realize. This isn't saber-rattling. This is contingency planning, and contingency planning of this nature means the contingency is considered genuinely possible.
Let's now turn to a story that marks a grim anniversary. 4 years ago this month, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and Al Jazeera has published an in-depth examination of how those 4 years of war have changed Russia itself. The findings are both fascinating and deeply troubling.
This is one of those stories that gets overlooked because the focus, understandably, is on the devastation in Ukraine. But what's happening inside Russia is equally important for understanding where this conflict is headed. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, the war has fundamentally transformed Russian society, from curbs on civil rights and political freedoms to tangible changes in everyday life like fewer choices at the supermarket and rising prices for basic goods.
Let's start with the political dimension. Russia was already an authoritarian state before the invasion, but the war has accelerated the crackdown on dissent to a degree that even many Russia watchers didn't anticipate. Independent media has been almost entirely eliminated. Protesting the war can land you in prison for up to 15 years. The space for any kind of political opposition has essentially been closed.
And what's remarkable, and this is something the Al Jazeera reporting highlights, is that despite all of this, support for the war remains high among the Russian public. Now, we need to be careful with that finding because measuring public opinion in an authoritarian state where expressing the wrong view can get you imprisoned is inherently unreliable. But even accounting for the chilling effect on honest polling responses, there does appear to be genuine support for the war effort among a significant portion of the population.
That support has been manufactured through one of the most comprehensive propaganda campaigns in modern history. Russian state media has created an alternative reality in which the invasion is a defensive operation against NATO aggression, in which Ukrainian identity is essentially fictional, and in which Russia is fighting for its survival against a hostile West. When you control the information environment that completely, you can sustain public support for almost anything.
But the economic effects are harder to hide. Western sanctions have dramatically reduced the availability of consumer goods. International brands have left the country. The ruble has been volatile. And while Russia's economy has shown more resilience than many predicted, largely due to continued energy sales to China and India, the average Russian is feeling the pinch. Fewer products on the shelves, higher prices, and a growing sense that the pre-war standard of living is not coming back anytime soon.
There's also a demographic dimension that doesn't get enough attention. Hundreds of thousands of Russians have left the country since the invasion began, and these are disproportionately young, educated, tech-savvy professionals. Russia is experiencing a brain drain that will have consequences for decades to come. At the same time, the military has suffered enormous casualties, and the mobilization efforts have pulled hundreds of thousands of men away from their families and their jobs.
And here's what ties this to the bigger picture. A society that has been this thoroughly transformed by war doesn't simply go back to normal when the fighting stops. The authoritarian infrastructure that's been built, the propaganda apparatus, the security state expansion, the economic restructuring toward a war footing, all of that persists. Russia after this war will not be the Russia that existed before it, regardless of the outcome on the battlefield.
Which means that any peace deal, any negotiated settlement, has to account for the fact that you're dealing with a society that has been fundamentally reshaped by 4 years of conflict. The institutions of repression are stronger. The independent voices are silenced or exiled. The economy is restructured around military production. This is the new Russia, and the world is going to have to deal with it for a long time.
Now we want to turn to a story that sits at the intersection of international sports and international law, and it's one that could set a groundbreaking legal precedent. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, a formal referral has been made to the International Criminal Court targeting the leadership of both UEFA and FIFA for what the complainants describe as ignoring Israeli violations of international law.
This is a fascinating case, Maya, and it deserves serious attention because it challenges one of the most powerful institutions in the world, international sports governance. The argument being made is that by allowing Israel to continue participating in international football competitions without consequence, despite documented violations of international humanitarian law, FIFA and UEFA are complicit in those violations.
Let's break down the legal theory here because it's important. The referral to the ICC isn't arguing that Gianni Infantino or Alexander Ceferin personally committed war crimes. It's arguing that by failing to act, by refusing to suspend Israel from international competition despite overwhelming evidence of violations, the leadership of these organizations has become complicit in maintaining a system that enables those violations to continue.
And there's precedent for this kind of argument. We saw it with South Africa during apartheid, when the sporting boycott became one of the most effective tools of international pressure. South Africa was banned from the Olympics from 1964 to 1992, and it was banned from FIFA from 1976 to 1992. The sporting isolation was widely credited as one of the factors that contributed to the dismantling of apartheid. The question being asked now is, why hasn't the same standard been applied to Israel?
That question has been asked with increasing urgency since the beginning of the military operations in Gaza. Palestinian football has been devastated. Stadiums have been destroyed. Players have been killed. The Palestinian football infrastructure, which was already operating under severe constraints due to the occupation, has been further decimated. And yet Israel continues to compete in UEFA competitions, hosting and playing matches as if nothing is happening.
FIFA's own statutes actually provide a basis for action. Article 3 of the FIFA statutes commits the organization to respecting internationally recognized human rights. Article 14 gives FIFA the authority to suspend member associations that violate its statutes. The argument being made is that FIFA's refusal to invoke these provisions in the case of Israel represents a selective application of its own rules that amounts to complicity.
And the ICC referral adds a new dimension to this. Even if the ICC ultimately declines to take up the case, the referral itself creates a legal record and establishes a framework for holding sports governing bodies accountable for their political decisions. Because make no mistake, the decision not to suspend Israel is a political decision, just as the decision to suspend Russia from international competition after the invasion of Ukraine was a political decision.
That double standard is at the heart of this case. Russia was swiftly suspended from virtually all international sporting competition after the invasion of Ukraine. There was no debate, no hand-wringing about keeping politics out of sport. The action was immediate and comprehensive. The contrast with the treatment of Israel could not be more stark, and it raises uncomfortable questions about which violations of international law the sporting world considers worthy of consequence and which it does not.
If this referral gains traction, it could fundamentally change the relationship between international sports organizations and international law. It could establish the principle that sports governing bodies have affirmative legal obligations to respond to documented violations by their member states. That would be a seismic shift, not just for football, but for the entire architecture of international sport.
And it would force organizations like FIFA and UEFA to choose between their commercial interests, because Israeli football generates revenue, attracts sponsors, and Israel is a market, and their legal obligations. That's a choice these organizations have been able to avoid until now, and this ICC referral is an attempt to take that option off the table.
Let's move to our final story of the evening, and it's one that brings the reality of war crashing back into focus. According to Al Jazeera, at least one person has been killed in a wide-scale Russian attack targeting Ukraine's energy sector. President Zelensky confirmed that the main target was energy infrastructure, but residential buildings and a railway were also damaged in the assault.
This attack is part of a pattern that we've been covering for months on this show. Russia has systematically targeted Ukraine's energy infrastructure, particularly during the winter months, as a deliberate strategy to break civilian morale and make life unbearable for ordinary Ukrainians. This is not collateral damage. This is a calculated campaign against civilian infrastructure.
And let's be precise about what targeting energy infrastructure means in practice. It means people without heat in the middle of winter. It means hospitals running on backup generators. It means water treatment plants unable to function. It means millions of people plunged into darkness and cold. The targeting of energy infrastructure is, under international humanitarian law, potentially a war crime because it constitutes an attack on objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population.
The scale of this particular attack is significant. Zelensky described it as wide-scale, meaning this wasn't a single missile strike on a single target. This was a coordinated assault using multiple weapons systems across multiple locations, designed to overwhelm Ukraine's already battered air defense systems and inflict maximum damage on the energy grid.
And the timing matters too. We're still in winter. Temperatures across much of Ukraine are below freezing. Every power plant that's knocked offline, every transformer that's destroyed, every transmission line that's cut means real human suffering. Elderly people freezing in their apartments. Children going to school in unheated buildings. Hospitals unable to keep critical equipment running. This is the weapon that Russia is wielding against the Ukrainian population.
What's particularly notable about this attack is the targeting of a railway alongside the energy infrastructure. Railways are critical not just for civilian transportation but for the logistics of humanitarian aid, for evacuation routes, and for keeping the country's economy functioning. Attacking rail infrastructure is an attack on Ukraine's ability to sustain itself as a functioning society.
And we should note the human cost that's been confirmed so far. At least one person killed. That number is likely to rise as search and rescue operations continue. But even one death from a deliberate attack on civilian infrastructure is one too many. Behind that statistic is a person with a family, with a life that was ended because Russia decided that their neighborhood was an acceptable target.
The international response to these attacks has become almost formulaic at this point. Condemnation from Western leaders, pledges of additional air defense systems, calls for accountability. But the attacks continue, week after week, month after month. The gap between the rhetoric of support for Ukraine and the reality of what's happening on the ground is a gap measured in destroyed power plants and lost lives.
And this is where we need to connect the dots across all 5 of the stories we've covered tonight, Alex, because the pattern is unmistakable. What we're seeing is a world in which the rules that are supposed to govern the behavior of states and institutions are being applied selectively, enforced for some and ignored for others, and ordinary people are paying the price.
Exactly right. Look at the through line. In Britain, activists protesting arms sales to Israel are imprisoned and driven to hunger strikes, while the arms sales themselves continue unimpeded. In Iran, the supreme leader is preparing for assassination or war because the international system has failed to provide any pathway to de-escalation. In Russia, an entire society has been warped by 4 years of a war that the international community has been unable to stop. FIFA and UEFA refuse to apply to Israel the same standards they applied to Russia. And in Ukraine, civilians freeze and die under Russian bombardment while the world watches.
The common thread is selective accountability. Russia invades Ukraine and gets suspended from FIFA. Israel conducts military operations that kill tens of thousands of civilians and continues to play in the Champions League. Russia targets Ukrainian energy infrastructure and faces sanctions. Western nations sell the weapons used in Gaza and face no consequences. Activists who try to disrupt those weapons sales get imprisoned. The rules exist, but they're only enforced when it's politically convenient.
And this selective enforcement doesn't just undermine individual cases of justice. It undermines the entire concept of an international rules-based order. When people see that the rules apply to some countries but not others, they lose faith in the system. And when faith in the system collapses, you get exactly what we're seeing: escalation, preparation for worse conflicts, and a growing sense that might makes right and international law is just window dressing.
The Iran story is a perfect example. Why is Khamenei preparing for assassination or war? In part because the international system has failed to provide security guarantees that Iran considers credible. The JCPOA was negotiated, then abandoned. Sanctions were reimposed. Regional adversaries conducted assassinations on Iranian soil. From Tehran's perspective, the rules-based order offers them nothing, so they prepare for the worst.
And the transformation of Russian society that we discussed is a warning about what happens when a major power fully commits to operating outside the international system. Russia has essentially decided that the costs of the rules-based order outweigh the benefits, and it has restructured its entire society around that decision. For years the war economy is entrenched, dissent is crushed, and the propaganda machine has convinced a significant portion of the population that they're the victims.
Meanwhile, in Ukraine, ordinary people are living through the consequences of all of this. They're the ones whose power plants are being bombed, whose homes are being destroyed, whose lives are being upended. And the international community's response, while significant in many ways, has not been sufficient to stop the bombing. Not sufficient to end the war. Not sufficient to protect civilian infrastructure from systematic destruction.
So where does that leave us? It leaves us in a world where the institutions that were supposed to prevent this kind of suffering, the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, FIFA, UEFA, national legal systems, are all being tested, and in many cases, found wanting. The ICC referral against FIFA and UEFA is actually a hopeful sign, because it represents people refusing to accept the status quo and trying to use legal mechanisms to force accountability.
That's an important point. In each of these stories, we see people fighting back. The Palestine Action activists who risked their freedom and their health to disrupt arms sales. The lawyers filing ICC referrals against sports governing bodies. The Ukrainian civilians who rebuild after every attack. The Russians who left their country rather than be complicit in the war. Individual courage in the face of institutional failure.
And that's ultimately what Truth Report is about. We're here to show you the connections that the mainstream coverage misses, to ask the questions that official spokespeople don't want asked, and to insist that accountability isn't optional, it's the foundation of any system that claims to stand for justice.
Before we go, let's be clear about what we're calling for. We're calling for consistent application of international law, not as a weapon wielded by the powerful against the weak, but as a genuine framework for protecting human rights everywhere. If Russia can be suspended from FIFA for invading Ukraine, then the same standard must apply universally. If arms sales to one country are sanctioned, the same criteria must apply to all.
We're calling for the protection of the right to protest. In a democracy, imprisoning activists to the point where they resort to hunger strikes is a failure of the system. Dissent is not a security threat. It is the immune system of democracy, and when you suppress it, the body politic gets sick.
We're calling for genuine engagement with the question of how to de-escalate the tensions that are driving Iran's leadership to prepare for catastrophic scenarios. Assassination and regime change are not strategies for stability. They are recipes for regional conflagration.
And we're calling for accountability for attacks on civilian infrastructure. Targeting power plants and railways in winter is not a military strategy. It is a strategy of collective punishment, and it must be treated as such by every court and every institution that claims to uphold the laws of war.
The stories we covered tonight are not just news. They are evidence. Evidence of a system that is failing the people it was designed to protect. And the first step toward fixing that system is seeing it clearly, which is what we try to do every night on this show.
That's all we have for tonight. I'm Alex Truth. Thank you for watching. Thank you for thinking critically. And thank you for refusing to accept the surface-level narratives that powerful institutions want you to swallow without question.
I'm Maya Clarity. Remember, the truth doesn't take sides, but it does demand that you pay attention. We'll see you next time on Truth Report. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never stop asking who benefits and who pays the price. Good night.